Biology, focusing on post-traumatic stress response, anxiety disorders, affective disorders, and addiction. Dr. Holloway continues to expand our understanding of the body's natural mechanisms for health, performance, and peace. He is being interviewed this morning by Craig Marshall, one of our Inside Edge speakers and friend. So, voila.
By way of introduction, as most of you know, I was a yoga monk and lived in an ashram for 35 years, so I really was focusing on mindfulness and getting a hold of my consciousness. And all of these things that dear Dr. Blake here is an expert at, like you mentioned, post-traumatic stress disorders and anxieties and addictions and all of those things. Well, that's what drove me into an ashram, right? Is to try to get a hold of these things. And then I ran into Blake through this device that I purchased, because I was always against external devices, and I learned that the definition of meditation is to sit down and shut up, right? And to really learn to control your mind and take hold as much as you can and go deep and pay the price, which takes time and energy. But through this New Calm device that I stumbled onto a few years ago, it has helped me get a hold of my consciousness within 2, 3, 4 minutes. It's unbelievable. So it's part of the package of my daily practice now. And then I finally got to meet Blake, and I realized that he is a person from outer space. And so, and this is very important for you to know up front, because in Eastern philosophy and the science of yoga, they believe that we as individuals cannot think an original thought. That's a humbling realization, that we just have antennas and we're picking up universally rooted thoughts, and these are like collectively ideas whose time has come and things like that. And so there's karma and destiny, all this stuff play into it. Well, Blake really is a conscious channeler, I believe. That's a great definition. Publicly I wouldn't introduce him that way because it sounds weird, but we're friends and family here. So as Blake channels this stuff, he has this incredible scientific vocabulary, because to him it is a science. But I'm going to channel Blake and help put it in language that maybe we can understand that much of, okay? So I think the goal this morning is for Blake to just sort of cast out some seeds that might intrigue us, and then if you want to follow up, there's lots of information at hand. But I truly believe that what he's talking about is very important. It's not like abstract science or something. It's something we all need, and our culture really needs, is to become more conscious pretty quickly, don't you think? Yep. And so he presents it in a way that translates to applications, to actual learning and devices which are helping people out. And he's worked with over 2,000 military veterans and has a 100% success rate with treating PTSD. Isn't that amazing? He is a give back guy. He is a caring individual. He helped out with the recent group in Texas that went through the trauma, and if you knew his history, you would have tears in your eyes. So why don't you start, Blake, by telling us what's new in neuroscience? What's the cutting edge? Can you give us some clues?
Well, this is in one way the great decade or the great age of the brain and neuroscience. We have perhaps made more discoveries about the human brain, not just dissecting it. People think we know a lot. There are still incredible mysteries in the brain. I'll talk about one of them today, but not quite 3 years ago, one of the most important discoveries about the brain in 200 years happened. And that's something called the glymphatic system. Has anyone ever heard that word, the glymphatic system? So the glymphatic system is the equivalent of having discovered that your brain has kidneys. And it's a...
Any questions so far?
Yeah, it's a topic of great concern socially and otherwise, because we have a rather significant peak in cognitive disorders in aging, Alzheimer's, dementia, not to mention brain injuries. And the glymphatic system is something that was designed to remove amyloid beta plaques from the brain. I think one of the great misunderstandings about that, however, is because the pharmaco-industrial complex tends to want to try to find a prescription to do everything, but there's a great misunderstanding, I think, about the glymphatic system in the brain, and that is that the glymphatic system is a hydraulically driven process. It has mechanics. The reason we didn't discover the glymphatic system for years was because if you're a neurosurgeon and I take a saw and I take the cap of your skull off, I cut through the dura, which is this encapsulation that our skull and the spinal, that's the reason our spinal fluid doesn't drop out on the floor, because it's in the dura mater. Dura mater in Latin means tough mother. And if you've ever been to a boot maker's, it looks a little bit like boot leather that a boot is made out of. But there is a process, and this is very, very interesting. It's really only taught in osteopathic medical school. It's not even taught in allopathic medical school. And it's called the cranial sacral spinal pump. And if you've ever worked with a cranial sacral therapist, this cranial sacral spinal pump, actually the sacral muscles act as a pump pushing spinal fluid up your spinal column, and then your skull is not one bone, it's multiple plates that are put together with little collagen tendons, and every time you breathe, these plates slightly open up. Think it's Thanksgiving time, think turkey baster. You squeeze and it pulls up, the sacral muscles are pushing up. You have 4 cushions up in the brain called ventricles, and these ventricles are little pillow cushions. It's where your spinal fluid is manufactured, and the cranial sacral spinal pump pumps up and fills those ventricles. And there's an oscillating pumping action. If that action does not operate right, the glymphatic system cannot operate right because it's not hydraulically correct. And one of the reasons we didn't discover the glymphatic system for years and years is because if I cut your skull off for surgery or something, the pressure in the hydraulic system is lost. There's no way to observe it. So how did we discover it? We discovered it we study mice. In neuroscience, we study mice. A mouse's brain is just as equivalent as a human brain as any species can be. And so we took fluoroscopic dyes. We injected amyloid beta plaque into the mice, and we could watch that fluoroscopically tagged amyloid beta plaque come up into the mouse's brain and watch the glymphatic system be able to remove it. I don't believe we'll ever find a medication that can do that. We're going to have a physio-mechanical process to do that. I think that may ultimately begin to look like something like frequency-specific ultrasound. We have been able to arouse a number of people from long-term comas by focusing frequency-specific ultrasound into a region of the brain called the thalamus. The thalamus is the equivalent of a router. We all use routers today. It routes the messaging. In that part of the brain is very likely one of the solutions to a great social medical crisis that we have today, which is the largest cause of death of people 50 and under, is drug overdose from the opioid crisis. I doubt that there's anyone in the room that doesn't know about the opioid crisis. So I've worked with the study of addiction for a number of years, and one of the things that is missed in addiction, and this is pretty shocking, addiction is a brain-based disease, and there are not even a handful of treatment centers that are very expensive that use a brain-based intervention for a brain-based disease. We live today in what I call a dopamine-dominant culture. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter, is the major player in addiction. Whether the substance be alcohol, whether it be cocaine, whether it be methamphetamine, hyperperfusion of release of dopamine is what triggers the pleasure response in addiction.
How about sugar?
Sugar does the same thing. And who has a smartphone or a tablet? Guess what? It does the same thing. Outside of San Francisco, there's a gentleman that has opened up a treatment center that is full of adolescents who would fight their parents and threaten to leave home for their relationship with their tablets and their smartphones. I recently had a 14-year-old girl brought into my practice, and the curvature of her 7 cervical vertebrae looked like a 95-year-old with osteoporosis. She could not raise her head up. My chiropractic friends now call that text neck. And
It's pretty scary though, isn't it?
I had to, I use a lot of external frequency specific lasers and otherwise to do topical scalp treatment that penetrates into the brain. And I had to completely reset her sensory motor strip that had become amnestic to the cervical neutral muscles that hold the neck upright, and the mother felt powerless to deconnect her from her devices. So how many of you have heard the word the eyeball economy? So the eyeball economy is all the digital delivery of information. Amazon, Google, everyone else is fighting for your eyeballs. It's the battle for attention. If you listen very carefully to television advertisements today, you will hear embedded within those, the soundtrack of those advertisements, 5 of the top notification messages that smartphones use, the sounds, the bings, the pings. It gets your attention. They have invented a wireless vest that you can wear so if people like your Facebook page, it will hug you. A kinesthetic vest.
It's pretty wild, isn't it?
LifeX makes programmable LED bulbs that have 16 million colors. You can wirelessly interconnect them with your Facebook page, and when you get a like, it will flash. All of that pumps dopamine at the same level as if you did a line of cocaine. And so I once had a company try to hire me to consult with them, a large food company, to create foods that will stimulate dopamine in the brain. You don't know that many of the processed foods that you have that sort of effort behind them. So I noticed on the table back there, and this is a soapbook issue of mine, please don't feel judged by me, but I want to give you a warning. There's a little blue packet back there of artificial sweetener that is called aspartame, one of the most neurotoxic products on the face of the planet. The neurologist Dr. Richard Blaylock wrote a book called Excitotoxins, The Taste That Kills. The process that approved aspartame through the government was one of the most corrupt, with incorrect information in the science about its effect. And I urge anyone that has it to throw it out, but please don't throw it out where an animal can get it. I have had patients come into my practice for migraines. If I did nothing else to intervene on their migraines and I remove them from aspartame, they have 30 to 35% fewer migraines. It is a glutamate excitotoxin that actually exhausts the brain cell to the point of death. So these are some of the things that we fight. In terms of the addiction crisis that we have these days, what is so sad is that the number one trigger for a recovering addict or alcoholic to relapse is stress and anxiety. If you are a patient in an addiction recovery center and once you're detoxed and once you're into treatment, if you have a comorbid anxiety disorder, you will be accused of drug seeking rather than having appropriate treatment for that anxiety disorder. Addiction is a multiple relapsing disease. If you had a heart attack and you have a second heart attack, nobody says to you, you can't come back into the hospital because you had a second heart attack. Yet if you're in an addiction treatment center and you relapse, sometimes they will expel you from the treatment center for what a clinical feature of the disease is, that it is a multiple relapsing disease. And high numbers of people who have addiction problems have this issue. I used to run a very, very major addiction treatment center, and I left them in an argument about us looking at brain-based interventions for people, and particularly anxiety and stress management. So I went into practice and I was dealing with people. I had patients that had been to treatment 15 times. I mean, it's really a big walletectomy to, to certain extents. And that's one of the etiologies of how my new calm system came about, because we needed a way to manage the anxiety that these individuals have and have some biological propensity for. We can't use Valium or other benzodiazepines for people that have addictive disease problems. So I began to look where the source of anxiety proceeds from, which is in an area of the brain stem called the nucleus ambiguus. It's also known as the pons, and that is where the vagus nerve, and vagal in Latin means wandering. The vagus nerve is not bundled in the spinal cord with the rest of the nerves, but the vagus nerve is connected to your heart, to every endocrine organ in your body. It innervates the entire viscera, your gut, your superior and your inferior mesenteric plexus, and is the superhighway for stress. And there are two lanes of the vagus nerve. There's the sympathetic, which is the accelerator to the floor. There is the parasympathetic, which is the rest and restore. And one of the primary triggers for relapse is sympathetic dominance, which has many effects on the problem. It's one of the problems with post-traumatic stress disorder. When you have post-traumatic stress disorder, your alarm system and alert system and threat system in the brain is permanently or semi-permanently altered. That's an area of the brain called the amygdala. If you want to understand post-traumatic stress disorder, imagine you're a house and you're wired for 110, 115 volts AC. A traumatic event tries to push 220 volts through a system that is wired for 115 volts. And what happens in that circumstance is that if you didn't have a junction box that would switch off and stop that, you will burn the wiring out. So the body has to create an equivalent of that. At the level of physics, let me tell you what that looks like. So that incredible 220 volts that's trying to come through there has to go somewhere. Where does it go? It goes into an area, we're now talking about physics. So have you ever shopped at the market for key limes? So key limes come in a little mesh bag, right? So what happens to the individual who is suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder is that particles of light, photons, get caught in a plasma field, a mesh plasma field, and that drops just beneath the surface of physicality in a place. And it continues to cycle, and it is the storage medium for that. We cannot treat post-traumatic stress disorder unless we have a methodology to be able to disrupt that plasma field so those photons can fly out and go back into the stream, because they chronically stimulate the amygdala. If you want to understand the amygdala, Let's say you've gone out for a nice hike someday and you see a snake over the path and you run back and you turn around and you see, no, it was not a snake, it was a twisted vine. The amygdala is your primitive threat system. And so post-traumatic stress disorder is like when there's a fire in the house, you may call the cleanup crew, everything's cleaned up, and then you put the 4-digit code into your alarm system to turn it off. It does not accept the 4-digit code. You must be able to reset the amygdala. When you cannot reset the amygdala, it restricts blood flow to the prefrontal and frontal cortex of the brain. And what do you have? You have depression. There is no medication that can resolve that type of depression, of restricted cerebral blood flow. You must be able to depolarize. Brain cells polarize, they take in a charge, all cells do. They depolarize, and as long as the amygdala is in hyperpolarization, you will be cycling into that. At this point, I can never talk about post-traumatic stress disorder without reminding you all, we're not that many days away from Veterans Day, but what I will tell you is that 30 vets will lose their lives this week from suicide because of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Blake has done such amazing work with so many people for so long. He's a real hero, and I'm thrilled that this is finally getting acknowledged and moving into the mainstream. And somebody sent me an article from the Journal of Behavioral and Brain Science where they were reviewing on the highest scientific level and going to be republished in peer-reviewed articles about his new calm system. So can you tell us in lay language how this helps, how this works, you know?
Yeah. So basically, the new calm system is a biomimetic or biological equivalent. It's a mimicry of the way the biological feedback system that cuts off the in high anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder, you have a triad. You have the hypothalamus, which is the metabolic control center in the brain, and the hypothalamus sends a chemical signal to the anterior, the front of the pituitary, and the pituitary sends a chemical signal to the adrenal glands that live on top of your kidneys. And then those glands release norepinephrine, epinephrine, a high level of hyper-stimulating chemicals that are meant to stimulate you for an emergency. But imagine that you have a furnace or an air conditioning system and you set the thermostat to 75, and when it reaches 75, it doesn't turn off. So you have the hypothalamus, the pituitary, the adrenal, so that's 1, 2, 3. What should go back is something called a negative feedback loop. In your AC and heating system, you have a negative feedback loop. It reaches 75, it goes back and says shut off. The negative feedback loop is lost in post-traumatic stress disorder and even in acute stress responses. It's not working. The new calm system is designed to create that negative feedback loop in exactly the same way the body would do it if it were doing it. So it's what we call a biomimetic, a biological mimicry of operating negative feedback loop. So we have examined this through, there's this great heart-brain connection. I'm a bit of a specialist in heart rate variability, and your heart action is operated right out of the vagal system in the base of the brain. So if you look at heart rate, looking at heart rate variability is based on you want nice even heartbeats. You don't want even heart rate variability. Heart rate variability is the interbeat measure of the heart. It has a direct connection to the brain through the baroreflex wave. What's that? The baroreflex wave is this wave that comes from the heart. It's very slow. It takes 5 seconds from the heart up to the brain. Then the brain reads it and the brain sends it back. It takes 5 seconds to come back to the heart. That's a 10-second round trip. If any of you have been to a yoga studio, you've been in the monastery, one of the places starting mindfulness and meditation, the doorway, I tell people, is the breath. If you synchronize your breathing pattern with that baroreflex wave, which will be one respiration cycle, an inhale and an exhale, that takes 10 seconds, 6 breaths a minute, in about 2 minutes, the vagal system will go into parasympathetic. It forces to turn on the parasympathetic side of the equation. When you look at heart rate variabilities, I have hundreds and hundreds of heart rate variability studies with people with post-traumatic stress disorder. I usually see the most acute spectrum of individuals with post-traumatic stress disorder, from torture victims to, I've now lost count of the veterans, but you can see an immediate change in the heart rate variability measure. We take those measurements, we take 50 millisecond slices of the heart, and then we process them mathematically so they come out as a power spectrum. When I'm coaching people for mindfulness and otherwise, we want to look at a part of the spectrum that we call the meditator's peak, or we call the Zen peak. It's at 0.10, and when we see that go up, you have coherence between the heart and the brain. Many people do not understand that the heart is an endocrine organ. It's not just a pump. It has an incredibly dynamic integration and connection to the brain. So the heart-brain connection is really, really big. And for example, if you look at people that are cancer survivors and we look at their heart rate variability, I used to work a lot with cancer survivors. I had a woman one time who had pretty successfully going through typical cancer treatments. I asked her, I said, well, do you have any fear that the cancer is going to come back? She said, oh, absolutely not. I trust deeply in God. I know this is absolutely over. I put her on EKG and pulse wave measurements, and I asked her that question, and her heart rate variability dropped to the bottom of the trough. That's not what she felt inside. She was, in point of fact, terrified. So that's a very interesting complex. There are, when you get people's heart rate variability, their coherence in line, you see incredible metabolic shifts in the body. People that are sympathetically dominant, cells are electrical capacitors. So what do they have? They have a Gauss field. They have a little electromagnetic field around them. That's where your enzymes hang out. When you are sympathetically dominant under stress, the enzymes, like compass needles, will point in the wrong direction and makes them less effective. Everything happens in your body biologically through enzymatic activity. We also know, for example, that this began as early as Otto Warburg, who won the Nobel Prize for cellular respiration. Dr. Warburg said what happens in cancer is that, first of all, the cell becomes oxygen deprived. You're not taking in good full tidal volume of oxygen, and then the cell begins to burn sugar for fuel rather than oxygen, and then loses its electrical charge, and that is when you get a good cell gone bad.
Isn't this interesting to look at it all in a scientific way? And we didn't learn this in school, did we? Because this is new, cutting-edge information, right?
Yeah.
And I know I don't relate to post-traumatic stress. I mean, I lived in a monastery. You know, it was the most peaceful place imaginable, and yet I was still part of the 20th century, right? You know, and so I have the garden variety challenges and, you know, an acceptable or manageable level of stress. But using Blake's new calm system, it's like it resets my consciousness when I didn't even know that my stress level or, you know, the bubble machine was bubbling at a certain rate, you know? And so to be able to push reset in a scientific, meaning repeatable, meaning it works every time, is like a miracle to me, but to Blake it's just science.
Well, if you look at the brain, if you look at EEGs, and if you look at heart rate variability under the influence of my new calm system, you can, in a very short time, see the brain go into exactly the same state that it takes an advanced Zen meditator 4 to 5 years to achieve. It will place the brain and the heart in the same place. So people had started calling our system Zen in a box or monk in a bag.
I guess that's a compliment.
Yeah. But well, it's like your portable Zen station. I'm somewhat, in my area of the country where I practice in San Antonio, Texas, kind of the king of irritable bowel syndrome, and Crohn's disease. And my number one treatment, other than nutritional and otherwise, is placing people on regular interventions with the new calm system, because it stops the hyperinflammatory response in the gut and allows the gut to heal through taking the person out of sympathetic dominance into parasympathetic dominance. I wanted to show you a little thing. We're doing a lot with brain now with photobiological modulation using light, frequency-specific light. This is a little experimental device that I'm playing around with, and so you see this? This is a laser frequency. Do you know where this goes? This goes up in the nasal cavity. Up in the nasal cavity, this laser-specific frequency irradiates the blood through the nasal vasculature and goes into the brain, where we are now cataloging things called chemophores. And these chemophores are photobiologically activated chemicals in the brain, and we're beginning to see some really potentially on the edge data for this, for affecting and rolling back some dementia. So I think there's a great future in photobiomodulation. My post-traumatic stress disorder treatment, the number one tool, this looks like what you would do in a slideshow. This is a specific, frequency-specific 405 nanometer blue scalar laser, and this is what I use to reset the amygdala in the brain.
How do we get all these things?
So,
Yeah,
It's-
that's a good question, Diana. You know, if anybody does want more information, you can contact me and I'll put you in touch with the websites and where you can get a lot more information. But isn't this fantastic?
Yes.
You know, because it is science, it is proven, it is being studied. On their team is the top sleep expert at Harvard. People all over the world have tried to debunk Blake's stuff for years, you know, and they come up against the science.
yeah. Yes.
I spent 10 years with an anorexic, thinking that unconditional love, which she hadn't had,
Mm-hmm.
would be the answer.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't work, and she nearly took me down.
Mhm.
Now I understand why. Do you work with extreme anorexic?
From time to time, I have. There's a really a big thing going on in a part of the brain of anorexics that has to do with the organic cation. That's a cart. That's fancy word. It's like a cart that deals with taking serotonin into the receptor site in the brain, and also a part of the brain that's about this far down, located back here, that really has to do with body recognition, sensorial body recognition, and it's really kind of where the seat of your personality is. And it's also the part of the brain where compassion is. The interesting thing about mindfulness and a meditation practice is that mindfulness and an appropriate meditation practice will grow more cells in this area.
Well, your heart and brain were right on, because her initial problem was molestation at an early age.
Oh, yeah.
Before the age of 5.
Absolutely.
My grandfather.
Yeah, and that
And it
and
only came out through scopolamine.
early childhood abuse is more recorded in the viscera in the gut than it is in the brain. And you have to work with early childhood trauma in a much different way than you do a more adult. Do you know there's more serotonin in your gut than in the brain? Thousands of times more. Yes.
Yeah.
We have a microphone here.
Oh, oh,
Kevin.
oh, there's a microphone.
Kevin's got
Oh,
one.
okay.
Try that one and see if it works. I didn't hear the
Hold on.
use.
Okay, my question, you talked about vibrational or energy
Mm-hmm.
thing. And there's a treatment called life streaming and another one called amp coil.
Mm-hmm.
The idea being that they'll raise the frequencies or lower them according to what they diagnose.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with that?
I'm not familiar with those specifically. I think I'm familiar with the principle. Essentially, if we want to heal anything, we really do have to deal with the lost electrical charge at the cellular level.
So that's what they're trying to do?
I'm not familiar with the terms you're using for those therapies, but you can't, almost anything that you would call a disease or state or something is a loss of information. That information is vibratory, it's oscillatory, and it is electrical. So in my practice, if you come in, I don't really care about the name of the diagnosis. I want to find out where the biological information is being lost so that we can restore the oscillation of that. You restore the biological information, you correct the dysfunctioning system.
Doesn't that make intuitive sense?
Unless you have then that diagnosis, I mean, if you just go and you stand on this plate and it vibrates a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
and, or you put this coil and it supposedly changes your vibrations,
Mm-hmm.
but you're saying that won't work unless you know where the information problem is?
Yeah, you need to know what information is really being lost or degraded.
How do you find that out?
I use a process of photobiology where I measure the vascular autonomic pulse while exposing color filters. The human biological system in your body is both a photoemitter and a photoreceptor. And so we can discover out of 7 different frequencies, just like a prism, what particular information system is low in its response or is blocked in its response.
Thank you. Okay.
Two more questions. We'll have two
is
more
this on?
questions.
Stan.
Yeah.
Stand up.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Hi. You mentioned several diseases, Alzheimer's, depression, post-traumatic stress. And does your methodology work for something like epilepsy?
Epilepsy is a tricky little thing. There are things that we can do for epilepsy. In my opinion, one of the great potentials for epilepsy is in CBD oil, which comes from cannabis without the psychoactive substance in it, which really has a great capacity to stabilize cell membranes. I'm working on a project right now for the organic cation transporter for GABA. Epilepsy is primarily a failure in the GABA system, which keeps cells from overfiring. And so there's an enzyme called the glutamate decarboxylase enzyme that takes excitatory glutamates and converts it to GABA. GABA is like the engine coolant for the brain, keeps it from getting overstimulated, overhot. And seizure activity can also be a genetic failure in GABA synthesis. I'm actually working on sonifying the signaling for those pathways where we may be able to modulate them through neuroacoustics.
And is that regardless of the cause of the epilepsy, whether it be an actual organic a deficit or something that's not going, that the brain is not correctly put together, or just some people just have it with no organic malfunction of the brain? I mean, it's not like some kind of a cyst or something like
Well,
that.
lesions are a little different thing. You
Yeah.
can have lesions. That's a little bit different thing.
Yeah.
There are some genetic misspellings for signaling that are involved with GABA, but sometimes you can also regulate those. I think some the potential of photobiological modulation, we may have some capacity to affect through combination therapies that in the future.
Good, well, we could go for days here. Let's give
Yeah.
Blake a round of applause. And Blake, thank you. Blake, wow. Thank you so much. More 5-syllable words than I've heard in 5 years. Let me tell you.